Hello world of YouTube. With Tom Holland's third entry in his trilogy coming out this weekend, Spider-Man Far From Home, a movie that sees the reintroduction of not only Electro from The Amazing Spider-Man 2, but all three of the villains from Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy, I figured I would sit down and take a look at the most notorious entry in that Raimi trilogy and try my hardest to make it a little less sloppy. Which, admittedly, wasn't as hard of a task as I thought it would be, but also presented some interesting concepts that I want to spin into the Raimi Spider-Verse, as it were, and sort of take what he did and round out the sides a little bit, conceptualize a version that's a little less dodgy. Talking about the 2007 misstep that led to the rebooting of the live-action Spider-Man series as a whole that was Spider-Man 3. Now, when pulling together and making this video, there were two surprises for me personally. One, I didn't realize how many TikTok songs actually stem from this movie.
You want a staff job and you want a staff job. Anybody care about what I want?
I do.
Shut up. Get out.
How'd that get in there?
See you, chump. What the hell?
So good.
And there's actually a decent amount of Spider-Man 3 that holds up a lot better than I thought it would, because when I walked away from this movie as a kid, I wouldn't say that I hated my experience, but my memories with this film aren't as well articulated, I guess, in my mind as Spider-Man 1 and 2 are. Two movies that are much better than 3, even if they aren't perfect, but at least have a better full-fledged experience in Spider-Man 3, because a lot of the crux of Spider-Man 3 mostly lies at a pivotal point in the movie, and it's when Venom is introduced. And so the first thing I would change is that I would keep Eddie Brock in this movie. I wouldn't keep him cast as Topher Grace. I'd probably go for someone else. I don't know, like even Ryan Gosling would do a better job at Venom, I feel like, than Topher Grace did. Topher Grace just is not a good casting choice whatsoever, which, given these movies have pretty decent casting choices overall, I think the other villains in this trilogy are fantastic. Thomas Hayden Church is great. Obviously, Willem Dafoe is fantastic, and so is Alfred Molina. There's a reason why they're coming back in No Way Home. Hell, even James Franco, for as fucked up as he is, was really good as Harry Osborn in these movies, and he had a great chemistry with not only Tobey Maguire, but Kirsten Dunst as well, and I would honestly keep a lot of their dynamic that's in this movie intact. You know, it's just when Venom comes in that's this movie's biggest problem. You know, Eddie Brock makes sense in this movie even, and given the symbiote stuff, I don't think was in the initial idea of this movie, because Sam Raimi more wanted to focus on like the Vulture and stuff, but I think that having the producers wanting him to add Venom in this movie wasn't necessarily a bad idea. I just think that the symbiote stuff should have been the bigger focus and left Venom for a whole nother movie, because this movie's trying to do a handful of things, and it leads to the biggest problem that a lot of underwhelming Spider-Man movies are, and that it's got too much going on. It's trying to tell multiple stories at once. And in this movie alone, you've got the symbiote stuff, you've got the dissolvement or the tension in MJ and Peter's relationship, you've got Eddie Brock, you've got Gwen Stacy jealousy coming up, you've got Peter and Harry's relationship, you've got a full circle with the Sandman, and then you've also got Venom in that, which just makes no sense. It just adds even more complications to the mix. And so while there's a lot of what I just mentioned I would keep, Venom, and by proxy, the third act of the movie, is getting the biggest overhaul. With that said, Acts 1 and 2, actually pretty solid for as much as they have going on, because so many of the cooks in the kitchen are well-established storylines and characters from the last two. They don't feel as overbearing when having stuff like Gwen Stacy and Eddie Brock come into the mix. And I feel like the biggest focus of this movie should have been Peter Parker's, relationship, the growing problems that stem from being Spider-Man as a more prolific hero in the public's eye, I actually really like the angle of not only focusing on the division between MJ and Peter with their relationship going through this really harsh period. Peter is planning on asking MJ to propose, but she's going through her own problems because she was trying to be this big star on Broadway, but then that fell, and while she's happy for her significant other, she hates that he's so wrapped up in it that his ego is just driving him off the rails, something that feels even more hammered in with the symbiote stuff. That's why I kind of like that the symbiote suit is in this. And I think that Eddie Brock and Gwen Stacy act as good wrenches in Peter Parker's life to a handful of degrees, and I feel like this movie, for the most part, handles them relatively well as far as the sort of further distancing of MJ and Peter's relationship with the introduction of Gwen Stacy. I don't think she should be as much of a focal point as she is in this movie. I like that she is who Spider-Man saves in the high-rise scene. I like that they introduced that aspect of a potential relationship that I felt like could have been used in other movies, but I like that it's here. I wouldn't necessarily have Peter Parker, I wouldn't necessarily have Peter kiss Gwen at the ceremony. I don't think that really felt, even with an ego-wrapped Peter, I don't think that really felt on brand for the character. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't know. Rewatching it, that whole scene felt a little weird, especially given he's trying to propose to MJ. I don't know. That's a whole part of the conflict that I don't feel like needed to be there. I feel like even the amnesia stuff with Harry works really well and acts as a good sort of full circle moment because you get to see Peter and Harry's relationship as well, and I would keep that intact. Like I said, this movie, as far as the first two acts, I'm keeping a lot of it. The symbiote stuff I'm keeping because it further, delves into the ego side, the ego problem that Peter's going through at this point in the movie, or in the trilogy. You know what I mean? And I would use all of those elements, including the Sandman, to act as full circle moments for Peter in this trilogy. He gets to reconcile with Harry through the amnesia, and when Harry gets his memory back and then threatens MJ, I want to have this full circle moment between the two of them in the fight with Sandman in the end. I like the Sandman as a sort of full circle moment for Peter reconciling with the death of Uncle Ben. I would keep all of that there. I think that Thomas Hayden Church is great in this. I feel like his Sandman scene is fantastic, and I would keep all of that intact. While it would probably be in good conscience to cut a lot of the symbiote Peter stuff, like...
You got any with nuts?
I have some nuts. I could make some.
Go make me some. Now dig on this.
I'm not going to, because that stuff feels intrinsically tied to the identity of this film. I would instead of having him lose the symbiote suit in the church when it happens in the movie and creates Venom, I would instead, once Peter ruins Eddie's life by showing that Eddie faked a picture for the Bugle, I would leave Eddie out of the rest of the movie. I would have the moment where he sees Gwen with Spider-Man at the commencement ceremony, at the Key to the City ceremony, and that would be like the last we see of Eddie until the post-credit scene. But I feel like Eddie, throughout his point in the film, like Gwen, acts as a good sort of, again, wrench in Peter's life. He is a point of tension in his professional life, and I feel like that could build a good relationship or a good sort of nemesis, arch-rivalness that would flourish out more in other films, but that's sort of the other half of what I would want to do with this movie. Not only would I have those full circle moments with MJ and the Sandman and Harry, I would have Gwen and Eddie act as seeds for a second trilogy that would stem after this, because thinking of this as not only a bookend to something, but a start of something fresh, I feel like was the mentality Sam Raimi had with this movie originally. Again, just producer hands and all that sort of made that harder to do with what the finished product was. Because my biggest issue with this movie is where Peter is at the end of it, honestly. I feel like he should be in a completely different place. And that's what I'm trying to make the third act do. Like, I've talked a lot about what I think actually works about Spider-Man 3, and that I would keep intact, but the biggest thing I would change is the third act. And it mostly starts with the framework, because I would, instead of having Venom go to Sandman, I would have Harry go to Sandman, and they would orchestrate a plan to kidnap Mary Jane. Because once Harry remembers and he does the whole break up with Peter thing, I would then use that as the framework to kickstart the finale. You got Sandman and Harry with MJ, and prior to this fight, Peter's got a choice. You know, throughout the movie, he's had this will I, won't I with the symbiote suit, but given he sees he's going up against not only Sandman, but Harry, he decides to don the black suit. They go to the tower, they fight Sandman. It's a big action sequence. You know, a lot of the action in the movie I would keep, because I like the Harry fight with Peter in the beginning on Harry's glider before he gets the amnesia. You know, I like the action set pieces of Spider saving Gwen. All that Spider-Man stuff, honestly, is not that bad in this movie. The scene with Black Suit Spider-Man and Sandman, also a fantastic fight scene. I was really not surprised that the fight scenes in this movie held up, but I would keep pretty much all of them intact, but aside from altering the fight in the construction site at the end of the movie, where it's just Sandman and Harry and Peter. And what starts as a fight between Sandman and Harry versus Peter then flips with Harry and Peter versus Sandman. Peter's ego kind of gets the best of him, and he really lays into Harry, but they have this moment when Peter sort of gets knocked really hard by Sandman and kind of really gauges the situation. The symbiote quite isn't as much in his mind in a moment. And I want a moment that's sort of a mirror of the first one, where Harry's knocked off his glider and his glider's flying towards him. Not in the same way that it was with Willem Dafoe's Norman Osborn. I instead wanted to have sort of an off-the-rails experience where Harry has a slip-up and his glider's coming to stop him, and Peter saves him by throwing his glider into Sandman, which then kind of adds a domino effect. He saves Harry, and while Harry's still kind of vengeful, he sees that amidst the glider hitting Sandman, Sandman then recklessly hits MJ, or like the taxi that she's in, and MJ actually dies. I would love to have a moment like that, if only because throughout this entire trilogy, we've had losses. You know, Willem Dafoe's character dies, Alfred Miller, all the villains die. But the only real death that's had a lot of weight on Peter outside of Norman Osborn has been his uncle. And I feel like if we're going to have a bookend to a trilogy, there needs to be another significant passing or death or some significant moment in Peter's life to put him through some more internal conflict. Because that's the big thing with Spider-Man. He's all about that internal conflict. And in the death of MJ throughout this fight, Harry then sort of has his own moment of grief and goes into the shadows, and Peter goes even harder on Sandman, which then leads to Sandman's death. You can even have a moment where during the fight, Sandman's almost trying to reconcile with Peter, but because Peter is so wrapped up in the symbiote and he's kind of lost control for a minute, he just lays waste to Sandman, which kind of ties into some of the lines from the Spider-Man Far From Home trailer that don't necessarily tie into Sandman, which seems like a retroactive fit for this movie, but it still fits the themes of the trilogy all the same. You know, it's a little more brutal, but it lends to a little more of a revenge moment for Peter, and throughout this pain and revenge and anger and this lashing out of passion, he realizes, because of the suit that he's in and the ego and the power and all that sort of stuff, it's caused all of this. And through this grief, he has the moment where he then goes to the church and relinquishes himself from the symbiote powers. We don't show Eddie yet. Instead, we have a funeral for Mary Jane. You see Harry in the background grieving separately from Peter and Aunt May and everybody else. You can even have a moment where Peter catches eyes with Harry, and they have a sort of, agreeance that this is not a time to fight. This is a time to grieve. And then speech, great power, great responsibility, but you don't see him swinging into the horizon. You see him sort of going into the horizon with a lot more bleakness. Before credits roll, then we get end credit scene, mid credit scene, POV, Eddie Brock in the church, seeing the symbiote, getting the Venom powers, hype for new trilogy. That's really the biggest changes I would make to Spider-Man 3. Like I said, there's a lot of this movie that I would keep intact. The first 2 acts especially, not that bad. I would make some minor tweaks here and there, but the biggest changes I would make would come in the 3rd act. But yeah, it was honestly a lot of fun to do this. It was a lot of fun to sit down, rewatch this movie, talk about it, give my version of it. But now I pass it off to you. What did you think of my version of Spider-Man 3? What do you think of the original Spider-Man 3? Are you excited for Spider-Man No Way Home? Let's talk about Spider-Man hype in the comments down below. If you like this video, give it a like. If you want to see more of my music, gaming, and general nerdery content, be sure to subscribe. Special thanks to my patrons. If you want to join the ranks to get early access content, exclusive content, or to help drive the community, it's linked in the description. I'm going to get out of here, though. I've been Viral Rack. You guys have good days, lives, and situations, and I'll see you another day.